and we are ready to go. So, good morning. Good morning. On behalf of the Women's Forum, I am Kristen Pickett. I'm going to be here with you all this morning for our Coffee and Connect session with poet Frank X. Walker. And a little housekeeping, if you would please keep your microphones off unless you are asking a question. And also we are for a casual conversation. And so if you would like to ask questions out loud or via the chat, you are welcome to do so. And to get things started, I'm going to ask Professor Frank X. Walker to introduce himself, and then we'll open up the floor for some conversation.
Wow. I'm not used to introducing myself, but I'm Professor Frank X. Walker. I'm a professor in the Department of English and African American Africana Studies. This is my third tour of duty at UK. I've been a professor this is my 11th year, but I also worked here in administration. I ran the Martin Luther King Cultural Center when it first opened. Did that for 10 years, and I was an undergraduate here a long time ago. I'm a Kentucky native. I've one of 11 kids, and teaching is I guess my second career. I spent 25 years as an administrator, arts administrator the Kentucky Governor School for the Arts, Center for the Arts in Louisville, and Purdue University before bailing out to spend time writing. And have, I think, 11 collections of poetry out there somewhere in the world, a couple of anthologies, and I'm just getting started. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I didn't mean to put you on the spot with introducing yourself.
No, it's okay.
We're building off of the conversation that we had, or the talk that Whit Whitaker from the Lyric had with us last week. And one of the things that really resonated with me from his talk, and also from the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is the power of words. And you've mentioned that your career has been various things, not just a writer. And I'm curious how you, and even in today's time with news and all of the various ways that words are being used, can you talk about the power of words and how you came to be a poet and how words move you?
I'll try to. I think, for me, I come to words from two different directions. One, being raised in my mother's house, and my mother was my first teacher, but she was also a Pentecostal minister for 22 years. And so I learned the importance of rhetoric, the value and the strength, the danger words can do, and also their power to uplift and to move people in different directions. Very early, we didn't have a television in our house, but we had a radio, and we would listen to, I remember Mystery Theater and some regular theatrical productions that were made for radio. And so we could sit there together as a family and close our eyes and then still see all these amazing things that were happening inside the stories. And I think that sharpened for me the importance of words. I guess the last thing for me was that situation also created a vacuum that I feel with books. So the idea of being literate and recognizing the power of literacy became a clear thing for me at a very young age. And then as an adult, visiting prisons and hearing over and over again how so many young men and women talk about the path that led them to prison began when they were very young. as early as third grade when they fell out of love with school. And they didn't realize how that path was important until they had all this extra time now as an imprisoned individual, and they were just starting to read and appreciate the power of words and how books were expanding their mind. And they were so excited about so many things. For the first time in their lives, they never understood how important those books were. And they talked about teasing other kids when they were little for carrying books, and how they thought about books being products of nerdy kids or even white people. And this is my peer group. And so the idea of using words to do something good or to do something positive has been almost like a instinctual thing for me at this point in my life. But it all started very early, and there are layers of it that built up. And as a lover of books, it only seemed natural to me to want to write my own, especially when I discovered very early in my growing up years that there were things that were unequal. I remember as a 12-year-old going to the public library after I had exhausted what was considered the Black book collection, which was a single shelf in the basement in my county library. I asked the librarian why weren't there more books by or about people of color? And she said to this 12-year-old kid, why don't you write one? And I remember how that felt. She was addressing a kid, and those words hurt because she didn't mean them in a way to encourage me. You know, she was saying a whole lot of things that at 12 I didn't really understand, but I could still hear her voice ringing in my ears. So perhaps part of my, drive to write and publish is somehow connected to that suggestion from her that it was something I could never do anyway. That kind of negative reinforcement, was kind of flipped around to do something different. I think that's also part of why every year since I graduated high school, I've gone back to my home community to do something in the schools at every grade level. In fact, I'm only a little embarrassed to say out loud that, in my hometown, they have an annual Frank X. Walker Literary Festival, which I'm actually very proud of. But also when you come to the county line, there's a big sign that says, home of Frank X. Walker. So I feel like over the years, I've impacted the space that I love and I grew up in. And those are ways to push back against this idea that was kind of laid at my feet at 12 years old in a negative way. But it didn't take hold in a negative way because of all the positive stuff my mother had already put there to do battle with it in the first place. Believe it or not, that's a short version of the answer to that question. So I ramble a lot.
I love it. Thank you so much. And I'm curious, I want this to be a conversation with everybody, not just you and me. But I'm curious how, like I have my son is in 5th grade and I see him falling out of love of school, especially now that he's at home. And I'm curious I know you can't predict the future, but I'm just curious what the future 5 or 10 years is going to look like for kids who lose their spark and love of learning earlier than what you described, just because of the pandemic. It breaks my heart to think about people who are losing the love of words and losing the magic of books.
Yeah, but I think people have been predicting the demise of books for decades now, since the technology took off. And, when they first put Kindle on the market, they said it would shut down libraries and books would fall out of favor. But I think that happened for a little while. But what I find is people have more time because of the pandemic, and that they have more of an appreciation for books, largely because, you can only binge so much. Eventually your eyes start to hurt from watching so much television, and you've seen all the good stuff and at some point it becomes so dull that you don't even turn it on anymore. I see that happening in people's families that I know about, and I hope it's happening in a more widespread way. But I think because we have a vaccine that at least suggests that there's an end to COVID. But I think this period in our lives will always have an asterisk. Everything has been impacted by COVID, sports, school, education, how we learn. I think even when we go back to teaching full time, a lot of faculty will still prefer to teach online. There are so many benefits that they discovered. There's so many things they discovered about technology that, they had to learn that we would have passed on before because it was just too much trouble to relearn something. But now that we've done it, and then having a second year to do it even better, by the time this is over, I think this will follow us into the fall, unfortunately. We'll have become so adept at teaching online that there'll be faculty and students who prefer this format. And I think it'll make us better as teachers. I think it'll make people, realize that they have a choice, and hopefully bring more people into the education system. You could teach more students if you're doing it online. A classroom can only hold so many, but I've done programs this year alone where I felt like I was talking to one person. And then I found out later that, there were, I think, 2,300 people listening. It was an international storytelling festival. And I was, doing a poetry reading. But I had no idea that it was reaching that many people in that many countries in that space. So, I think we'll figure it out. I think we always do, as long as we keep students at the center of it. And the power of stories will never go out of business. Even the best movies are only as good as the story that is based on. So because I'm a book person, I always think the book is better than the movie anyway. And one of the things I also see happening is, and you mentioned having a young person reading. I'll share this anecdote. One of the things that made it easier for me is a broaden what's defined as a book. When I was about 10 years old, I had almost a full milk crate full of comic books. And those comic books for me were my treasure. And I owned them. I had my own library, but they cost a nickel or 10 cents a piece then. It was easy. Now I think that's, $3. Over time, that's how long it's been. But there was something about owning those books and being able to buy my own books and being able to pick out things that were really the things I was interested in, and not books that were assigned by a teacher or school system or my mother. I was reading what I wanted to read, and it helped me feel good about the reading experience. And I think that a lot of young people who might fall out of love with books can have their relationship kind of intensified by changing that format. I'm not saying remove all electronic devices, because one of the things that I've discovered since I also teach a comic and graphic novel course here at UK is that almost all those comic books are also available as ebooks. And there are software programs that allow students to also create their own books. So I've combined the creation of your own book and reading comic books in that format and graphic novels in that format in a way that's made teaching, say, Moby Dick more exciting, and allowing me to teach Moby Dick right alongside Spider-Man. You would never find that in a traditional classroom. So I think we have to be creative and find ways to be smart about what we're doing, and being clear about what our intention is when we go into considering how we might change things or rescue young people or keep books in front of them. But it is a challenging situation. We've got 15-year-old twins that are being homeschooled and a 2-year-old. And they're all as addicted to, they see me and their mother Zooming all the time. And they're doing the same thing. And so, I mean, it's interesting what this will look like in a year from now.
That's so true. Actually, I did see a graphic novel of Moby Dick the other day at the library, which made me laugh as far as how we were bringing books like the classics to the younger generations to try to engage them so that when you do have to read the big book, it's not quite so scary. I mean, I remember reading Moby Dick in high school and I thought it was just awful.
It's still scary.
Yeah. So we've I know we were originally going to talk a little bit more about Martin Luther King Jr. and the talk that Whitaker did. And I know that all things go into your writing. It's personal experience as well as things that are going on around you. And just from being around poets, I would not claim to be one by any stretch, but by being around poets, I know that all life experiences and everything you see contributes to or plants seeds for the poetry that you write. And I'm curious if you could speak to how Martin Luther King Jr. or all of the civil disobedience and all the different ways of social change have contributed to your words, or what calls to action we could take for the people in the conversation. And also, I really want other people to communicate, to speak up also. It's not just a me and, Brad typed something. Excellent.
Okay. Well, before I get to whatever Brad typed, I'll try to respond to some of the questions I heard in that longer question of yours.
I ramble also. You'll notice that.
We speak the same language. As far as Dr. King is concerned, I would say that I think it's very important to try to see him in a more holistic way than I think history has framed him. And I think history has shrunken or reduced Dr. King to this tiny box that only says, I have a dream. And if you judge or consider Dr. King's life and legacy simply on that speech and those words in that moment, you're missing probably 70% of the man. And you stop his growth and development and evolution politically, philosophically. You freeze him in a moment that's really a much younger and less nuanced King than he was at his assassination. I think that speech was in '63. A couple of years later, the shift in the civil rights movement was happening where it was less about legal and political equality, and it shifted to economic and social change in the community. And by '67, King was speaking out against so many things, particularly the Vietnam War. He had committed himself to a poor people's campaign that was galvanizing poor people in Appalachia, poor people who were Mexican-American, Puerto Rican, African-American, South, North, all over the country, simultaneously with this anti-Vietnam War campaign. He started committing himself to fair housing issues around the country. He was one of the first people to start talking about a living wage. And all these ideas I personally think made him more of a threat than he'd ever been. Before, he was just, this charismatic minister from the South who got people excited, and like it was just always a sermon. But, as he evolved, he still had the rhetoric of the sermon, but he was talking more about these ideas that if he had the power to change all of them himself, it would have changed America overnight. And I think it created more enemies for him. I think he wasn't surprised, nor were other people surprised that that he was actually taken out of the picture, because he was so threatening to where America was in that time period. So I'll just say that. How that connects to my writing, there was I taught a class with almost 200 students in it at UK, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I asked those students to tell me what they knew about civil rights era assassinations. And they mentioned MLK, JFK, Robert Kennedy, and then they kind of got stuck. And none of those students mentioned Medgar Evers. There are a few other people they didn't mention, but the fact that they did not mention Medgar Evers made me curious. And I started looking at high school textbooks and middle school books, and I saw that what had been happening over a period of a decade was that the sections on civil rights were getting smaller and smaller, and people were dropping off. And at some point, it was going to be Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and that's it. So I started researching Medgar Evers' life, and I ended up writing a book, called "Turn Me Loose: The Unghosting of Medgar Evers." And "Turn Me Loose" was actually the last words that Medgar spoke on his deathbed. He sat up in the hospital and said, "Turn me loose," and then expired. And the unghosting of Medgar Evers, part of the title comes from this idea that people didn't know who he was anymore. At least a whole generation of people. I assumed it was widespread. It was bigger than my classroom. And so I wanted to do something to help rescue his legacy and bring him back into the conversation. So there's a whole book of persona poems that include everybody in his life and death except him. Other than the title of the book, he doesn't speak in the book at all. It focuses on the words and thoughts and feelings, most of which I imagine that come from Baudre de Lubec with his assassin, who's the bad guy in the story, and his widow, Merle Evers, and they kind of act as foils to each other. His brother Charles speaks. History speaks in this short. This is the cover. It was a really thin book, but if you didn't know the history of Medgar Evers, you could consume this book. Even the bullet speaks in this particular collection. So you get this opportunity to learn about Medgar's life and legacy, but you get it in a way that history doesn't do for you. History books tell a story, and they must remain objective, and there's no emotional element in it. As a poet, I'm trying to tell the same story, but I'm also trying to make sure that every poem has an emotional temperature, so that when you read it or you hear it, you experience the emotional impact of that moment or that speaker, so that after the story is done, hopefully you've been moved to some degree. You felt some pain or some horror or some hope. And to me, it has the power of movies. With a movie soundtrack, you get sound and you get background sound, you get music, you get special lighting, all these things heighten the experience, so that when it happens on the screen, you feel it. You feel like you were there in that moment. So I try to borrow those same devices from film and cinema and use them on the page when writing persona poems about historical events. So that's my kind of crooked threading from my work, Dr. Luther King, and civil rights era, and poetry, how they connect to each other. If that makes sense at all, probably not.
It did, and it was an excellent segue to Brad's question, which was, what did you find most special about Medgar Evers and his work and impact?
How committed a family man he was. I think that most of the historical accounts mentioned that he was married to Merle and that he had kids, but you don't really get a sense of how committed he was to being a father until you do more research. You know, I read 2 autobiographies by Merle Evers. I visited Jackson, the hometown, several times and stayed up to a week and a half just to do research on the ground. I watched probably half dozen movies about Mississippi. And I had lived in Alabama, almost directly west of Jackson for almost 3 years. So I was very familiar with the space and the tenor of that part of the United States. So the research was not difficult for me to do. The difficult part was doing the research to get into the head and skin of the assassin. That was harder for me because he was a really dark person, you know. I mean, he fit all the definitions of sociopath. And he bragged about having committed the murder for years and years. And, you know, most people don't know that there were 3 trials, and it wasn't until the 3rd trial that he was found guilty. And he was an 80-something-year-old man at that point. He had lived his entire adult life being patted on the back for an assassination. And he had no remorse at the end of his life. You know, so he was an interesting character, but hard to try on, you know, and hard to get in his space because it was just so uncomfortable. But to answer the question, the short version is that when the family part of him, I've been working on a play for years about the Malcolm X people never get in the textbooks. And the play is about Malcolm X as a father and a minister. You know, people don't say Minister Malcolm X. They just say Malcolm, and they go straight to this fiery political person. But in the story I'm writing, the play I'm writing, he gets to the edge of the stage and he takes off the glasses and he takes off the coat, puts his briefcase down, and he crosses the threshold and he stops being the political person, becomes the husband and the father. And so the whole play is just those 2 people, his wife Betty and Malcolm, and you get to know him in that space as a human being, responding to these other things that are happening on the outside. And you find out how important his wife was in his development and helping to keep his fires low and keep him calm and to help him work things out that he couldn't do by himself. And I think that part of him, that human part of him, those are the kind of things that art can do that I hope the play will do when I get around to finishing it. Thanks for your question, Brad. Hey, Tara.
Hey, so I do have a question that relates a little bit more to your initial point about Martin Luther King. And I do want to make the point that a lot of times in history, we do juxtapose Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, which I don't think is necessarily fair, because recently I've been doing some research on Martin Luther King, how towards the end of his life, he was more, I don't want to say angry, but he was more agitated by some of the things that took place in the civil rights movement. But the core of my question is, how do you feel about where the nation stands in terms of the civil unrest and the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that? Because some people would argue that the civil rights movement never ended, it just took a different form. And to a degree, I mean, just with how hype the Black Lives Matter movement is, there's a part of me that's kind of like, well, maybe it did just take a different form. So that's my question.
I'll try to find the questions in there and work backwards from that. I think what's happening today is a new movement. And I think it feels new to me. I mean, I'm an old man. I was alive, but not active in the civil rights movement. You know, we lived in a rural community in Kentucky. My family didn't take the daily newspaper, and it didn't cover national news that dealt with those kind of issues anyway. If you go back through time, you know, they may have mentioned Martin Luther King twice in 6 years. So we might not have known unless we had family on the outside traveling in and out of the state. So a lot of people, like my family, were cut off from those national events. But I would say that I think it's a new movement because think about Kentucky is a red state. It has been for a long time, but there were over 60 counties in Kentucky that had Black Lives Matters marches or protests. So that's Fayette, Jefferson, of course, but that's 58, almost 60 other counties in this state that said, you know, we want to say something about this. We want to protest this. This is not right. And I think that's important. And then if you look closer, who is doing this? And this was mostly young people under 40, more so under 30, and multicultural, very diverse. You know, a lot of multiracial young people who have had trouble choosing which side they were on and chose a new side. You know, I think it feels to me like the birth of something new that leans towards purple, if not red, if not blue. And if that's our future, I feel okay about that. Yeah, I think we can get there eventually. But I also recognize that the people who are in charge right now were also very active in the civil rights movement. They may not necessarily have been on my side, but they are still in charge. If you need evidence of that, look at the pushback from the basketball team taking the knee. We had state legislators in tears on the Senate floor saying how much they were hurt and broken because those young men took that act and how they interpreted it. And even though the young men immediately after the game said in the news what they were doing and why they were doing it, but they were still so offended, they could not get to pass their own idea and this, that it had to be anti-American, anti-flag, you know, anti-soldier. And none of that is true. But that was this crying adult man. A week later, a sheriff, a man with power and a gun, and the jailer with the keys to imprisonment, our own television burning UK paraphernalia because of the same thing. So what this tells me is that, you know, that attitude, if you add to that, you know, how many individuals are now angry at Mitch McConnell. I mean, Mitch McConnell of all people, they're angry at Mitch McConnell because he's not more blatantly in support of the former president. And, you know, has now already committed himself to not supporting an impeachment. And that noise is very, very loud in the state from those individuals. You know, so that reminds me that in spite of all those protests by those young people, that their parents' generation and their grandparents still have a lot of power and are still holding on to an idea that they do not want change, that, you know, what they need to exist is how things have always been for them, where a certain element or individuals or families are in power and they refuse to cede that power. So that makes me hopeful. I think the movement has been really important. You know, I think if not for the protests, the public would have never seen what really happened with Daniel Cameron and his investigation. They would have never known how it was fraudulent from the beginning, that he never gave the jurors an opportunity to find those policemen guilty of anything else but the thing they found him guilty for. He took that off the table. And only since the jurors came out secretly, and he thought it was protected because they were sworn to secrecy, has this truth come out. You know, so I think those kind of power alignments and, you know, the things that allow them to operate in secrecy kind of prop up that power. So those protests are important. Those protests force people to recognize it. You know, I love the fact that so many people outside of Kentucky had embraced the Breonna Taylor situation and recognized, you know, how unjust it was. And even though there was a civil settlement, which to me announced some guilt, in advance. You know, I don't feel like justice has been done. And so there's a lot of things that I think that could be fixed. You know, if I had more energy and was a younger man, I might consider politics. But I'm just a poet. I just write books and teach students. That's all I do. These opinions I have on my own. They're not the university's. But they're the kind of opinions that mean, you know, I probably hit my ceiling at the university. You know, I can't go any higher than this because of my opinions. But I'm okay with that. You know, I think this is how my mother raised me. These are things I write about. These are things that are important to me. And, you know, maybe one of my students will be listening, and then they'll pick up the mantle and carry it forward. I probably didn't answer all of your questions, but you can infer the rest of the answers based on what I said, I hope.
No, it's okay. It helped.
Thank you.
If I may, because there's no other questions in the queue, I have one more that I'd like you to speak to. And it's basically how you started talking about Medgar Evers, and people don't really pay attention to the fact that he was a family man. And then Malcolm X, I feel like he doesn't get the same due diligence to how faithful he was as a husband, and Coretta Scott King, and how she helped to get Martin Luther King's birthday recognized. So if you could speak to women of the Civil Rights era, but also women of today too, because of course the Black Lives Matter movement was started by 2 Black women as well. So.
Well, you know, I think if you look really closely, the modern movement is predominantly women, young women. And you're right, the originators of the Black Lives Matter movement were all women, young women. You know, what that young woman did at the inauguration has resonated so much. You know, she now has a gig at the Super Bowl. When have they had a poet at the Super Bowl? What era am I living in that, you know, my sports, you know, and my love come together? I'm a little bit jealous they didn't call me for that, but I'm almost floating that those two things are going to intersect. So for me, that gives me hope. That gives me a sense of optimism, that the power of her presentation, and I think people are responding more to the conviction she had when she said what she said, as opposed to the actual words. They may remember a line or two, but they remember how they felt when she was done. And I think that's more important than anything. You know, people talk about, there's that line that says, you know, people may not remember what you did or what you said, but they will always remember how you made them feel. She obviously knew that. And by the time she was finished, people were floating. I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me to ask me if I saw it, or ask me what I thought about it, or to rave on about how amazing it was. And the thing about that is it gets me, and as a teacher of creative writing and poetry, on one hand, that hurts me a little bit, because what I understand is that they are so amazed because they don't know that there are thousands of Amanda Gormans out there, you know, in a 100-mile radius of where we're sitting. You know, there are tens of thousands around the country. And she's not the only one. And that powerful poetry didn't just start with her, that you could go back to before Phyllis Wheatley, to Lucy Terry, and find women speaking on the page loudly with power, giving truth to words, and trying to move and save this country. It's not a brand new thing. So to the degree that people treat her like a unicorn is a little hurtful to me. There's a book that just came out called 250 Years of African-American Poetry. And you know, it has 250 poets in it, including poets who are writing right now. And it's the most thorough, I think, anthology of African poets that's ever been produced. including what Norton did and what the Oxford American has done. There's nothing like that out there, so, but I bet you if you were giving away $100 bills on the street in Lexington today, if you could name 10 poets in this book, you get the $100 bill. You'd come home with all your money. And to me, that's criminal, that we don't know more about the people in that book. I give you an example. Most people don't have to learn about the Harlem Renaissance to get a degree in English from the University of Kentucky or anywhere else. But if you do, chances are, even in Kentucky, that you can understand the Harlem Renaissance and still never know that Effie Waller-Smith was a Black woman writing poetry in Eastern Kentucky, in the mountains, during the Harlem Renaissance, was published alongside Langston Hughes and all the other great Harlem Renaissance poets. But nobody ever made the connection. She knew what she was doing. People in her era knew what she was doing, but somehow it's only recently that her relevance was recognized and her importance kind of cemented alongside those other gentlemen and more famous individuals. It's nice to be the first African-American, male poet from Kentucky. But it's also a little lonely to be the first and the only. But then what makes me more sad is when people say that, I say, well, name another African-American male poet from Kentucky. Just one more.
I'll wait.
Take your time. Just one. So something's wrong. I'm not a unicorn. I'm an old man. I've been teaching for, feels like 100 years. I could probably name 20 that deserve recognition, that deserve to have their books purchased, that have books in print in bookstores, but somehow, the focus is still on Frost, still on Shakespeare, still backwards. So the canon for us in English is our challenge. It's still, there's all this energy to make sure it's still a domain of dead white men. Women belong in there more than they are. People of color belong in there more than they are. But there's so much energy behind maintaining a status quo that it makes it hard to break through and to get change. So I think all these things are connected. Martin Luther King was fighting for change and equality. His movement was propped up by women, like most Baptist churches that he preached at were predominantly women. Then and now, this movement in the streets, those people here in Lexington, there's a set of twin women who led the movement in Lexington every night, and while having kids at home, there's no extra income in that. How do you get a registered nurse to take this time away from her life to make sure Lexington is part of this movement? But they did that every night. To see the University of Kentucky women's basketball team with their shirts on and present and to have their voices represented, speak up for those injustices. When I was undergrad, those things didn't happen at UK. There was a huge vacuum between student athletes having the freedom and taking the opportunity to speak out and, being forced to remain silent. This is a brand new thing that's happened in this last year. If people don't recognize it, you have to go back a long way to find an athlete who would dare have a shirt on. So what's been happening nationally when you see the NBA and the WNBA with unity and justice and huge Black Lives Matters slogans on the floor and uniforms, this is a new era. This wasn't happening during the 60s. That's why I think it's not an extension of the civil rights movement, that it's brand new, because and young people gave birth to it and are keeping it alive. So back to answering the first question, it seems like, but they're all connected. I think all of this is connected. I'll stop there because it feels stuck. feels rambling-ish. I'll sip my non-coffee. Vera Brown, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
You guys all right? I see a bunch of chat stuff here. So there are questions in here. Oh, somebody loves my cup. Yeah. Well, you know, I'll tell you an anecdote about this cup. One of the first comic books I collected was the Black Panther. I think I have probably every issue of the Black Panther that's been printed in 40 years. I'm a comic book aficionado and a African-American or action figure of color collector. Have a large enough collection that I exhibit at universities and museums around the country. Of course, most of it lives in storage and a climate-controlled storage, because if it didn't, it would fill up this room and my wife would throw me out. But I think those images are important. You know, representation is important. And I always think about what I experienced as a kid and what I want my kids to experience and other kids to experience. So that's part of my drive to keep that collection going and those exhibits available. But I was teaching a film class, an African-American film class at UK, and took my students to a preview, kind of a sneak preview the day before the actual opening. We had the whole theater to ourselves, thanks to the Martin Luther King Center. And talking about Cloud 9 is to see those young people respond to that film when they first saw it. You know, I also was moved powerfully so by the power of it. And I predict that Black Panther 2, and it hasn't even been written yet, the only way it could top the first one is for the Black Panther's sister to become the new Black Panther. I predict that women will be the focus of this next installment, and it will make even more money than the first. So we'll see what happens. But you heard it here first. Any other questions? We have 9 minutes left.
We do have a few in the chat. One is somebody asking about the festival in your hometown. Will that happen in 2021? And if so, when does that happen? And do you have any details?
We don't have the dates yet. It happened in 2020. In fact, it went virtual because school was happening. So we still had it virtually. So I'm expecting it to happen.
Okay.
And it's always in early September or late August, usually early September. And it's a whole week. And what we try to do is make something literary happen at every grade level. I pop in and out of town and speak to classes, lead workshops. My theater group, Message Theater, has been there most years to present a formal presentation. I think the last one we did was The Meeting. The gentleman you heard, Whit, actually played Martin Luther King in that production. And my friend Patrick Mitchell played Malcolm. And the local police chief, Tony Gray, played Malcolm's security guard. First time on the stage and did a great job. And it brought out the entire town. They filled up the audience in a pretty nice theater at Danville High School. We've done some plays that I've written, particularly Isaac Murphy, I Dedicate This Ride. We did that there in Danville as well. And a couple of August Wilson productions we performed there. We did The Piano Lesson maybe 2 years ago, but it will happen, it still happens. They are almost as proud as my family is that it happens, so.
Love it. Another question from Kim. She writes, I would like to see the University of Kentucky acknowledge its racist history and present more directly in the hope that acknowledgement opens the door to healing. Are you aware of this happening in any way now currently? And if not, would you like to see this happen?
Well, I think it's a difficult thing for an institution to do. But I would like to see it too. But I would like to see it on every front from the top down. I think what's happening with the funding and the creation of the Commonwealth Institute out of the Department of African American Africana Studies, I think that's one way the university is making that statement. I think they could really make a statement if they would put the recruitment and retention of African American and other faculty of color, instead of just making it a mandate that, in my opinion, is not funded, is to put reoccurring funds in an account somewhere and say, this is to make sure these hires happen and keep happening, and that we keep these great faculty that we have here before they get stolen away by other universities. We've had a lot of, a lot of great faculty just kind of come here and then leave again. I'd love to see that happen. It'd be great to see them do something in a Rupp Arena on the floor that says this university supports diversity and equality. Because I think a lot of people are still kind of twisted up in this idea that UK is racist historically and can't ever change because of how strongly people defend changing the name of Rupp Arena. It's not even our building, but I don't think Rupp even played in it or coached in it. So, but legacies are hard to, people hold on to, people who are in power, want to stay in power. People resist change. People want young people to have change, but they want them to ask for it nicely and politely. But Martin Luther King, to make it circular, said, a riot is the voice of the unheard. If the people in power would listen to young people, we would not need to riot or protest. If they responded to what they were saying. So we need more young politicians instead of the same old guys who just want to keep the old ways happening all the time. But I think that some things are already happening. In the last 5 years, look at that amazing set of statues outside Kroger Field at the stadium. Those 4 young men, who represent finally integrating the SEC football, how UK led in that way. UK led in track and field. We had the first African American. He was Olympic caliber, but he got injured. Athlete, to win everything in the SEC. But you never hear about him. I think he needs a statue outside the track. I would say, we should get a quote by an African American poet and stick it on the side of the new student center, that big $20 million building. But it's already there, if you didn't notice. On the side of the building at the student center, that's a poem I wrote for the university's anniversary a few years back. And part of it is excerpted and stuck on the side of the building and backlit. The president's idea. So that's leadership from the top. So I see it happening in individual and small ways. But I wish when we get back to full time, I would love to see, when the camera pans the audiences at a basketball game or football game, that you see the diversity, that is not just a sea of 100% white faces, that the students and families and individuals who've been locked out of being in those spaces, that we start, to show our presence there and the classrooms, that we become a truer reflection of society and the country and the world. There's so much more we can do. We just got to step into the light and be it,
It is so true, and those are excellent words. are there any other last minute questions before our time comes to a close? Brad, thank you for sharing this link about Frank. I look forward to seeing all the information that includes.
Anybody? Last chance. Well, thank you guys for tolerating my rambling this morning. And you, Kristen, for encouraging me to borrow from my writing time to share with you. I'm a morning person. I don't drink coffee. I can't drink coffee because I'd be hyper for 4 days with just one cup. But I wake up like this at about 4:30, and this is when I do my best work in the morning. And I exhaust myself, and then I go do other people's work. But I'm just a poet, and I just got a bunch of poems, and sometimes I teach. That's my part of this. I know you guys will hold up your end. If you have, I do a commercial for my last book. The last book is called Masked Man Black. It's by Accents Publishing. And it's all pandemic and protest poems written last year. And it's almost a documentary about, what it means to live in the time of COVID, from March all the way through the end of the summer, at least. So if you like poetry, if you're interested in that work, you can go backwards on Facebook and find most of the poems when they were first written back in April. Or you can just try to find the book online and get your own copy. It's pretty cheap, $16, I think. It'll help buy some diapers. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not.
We're so thankful for your time, Frank. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm so thankful that you gave up some of your writing time. I didn't know this was your most prolific time of day. So
can you see me vibrating, bubbly?
I do. I see all sorts of seeds being planted for things you're gonna write about. And just to make sure that you are catching the theme of the chat, you are much more than a poet, just a poet. You are planting seeds, and you are inspiring lots of people to go out and make a difference, just like all the people that we've talked about today. So we are very thankful for you and your time, and wish you the best of luck on your writing today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.